President Trump has announced the cancellation of his planned summit with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. In a statement, the president said it was a missed opportunity and truly a sad moment in history. He blamed what he called Kim's tremendous anger and open hostility in Kim's most recent statement. The summit was expected to take place in Singapore next month. Well, our World Affairs correspondent Jonathan Marcus joins us now. And Jonathan, the White House have issued a letter that we've all now seen a copy of, addressed to the dear chairman.
Well, absolutely. It's kind of bizarre. I mean, it's completely vintage Trump. It sets out very clearly that it's very polite in its opening. Mr. Trump says that he greatly appreciates Kim Jong-un's time, his patience and efforts with respect to the recent negotiations. But he says very clearly that based on the tremendous anger and open hostility displayed in your most recent statements, and I think that is a reference to a statement from the Vice Foreign Minister in North Korea, who described the US Vice President as a political dummy, talked about either meeting the Americans in a meeting room or in a nuclear-to-nuclear exchange. So because of that, Mr. Trump has decided to pull the plug on these talks. One has to say they weren't going terribly well anyway. There was growing doubts about this. And then, of course, despite this rather polite tone, there is this explicit threat. Mr. Trump says to Kim, you talk about your nuclear capabilities, but ours are so massive and powerful that I pray to God they will never have to be used. So we're almost back now to the little Rocket Man days, the exchanging of taunts around their respective nuclear programs. And it's a rather dismal outcome, I think, to what appeared to be at one stage quite an optimistic diplomatic encounter.
And yet earlier today, we were reporting that North Korea, in a gesture ahead of this summit, had destroyed some test tunnels.
Well, it had. It claims to have done this. Obviously, one of the problems is that it brought a set of journalists to oversee the process from a distance. This isn't the same as a verified, investigation by inspectors to ensure what has precisely been done. I think that was always being seen as a kind of bit of showboating and a gesture. It was a nice gesture up to a point, but we simply don't know whether North Korea has alternative testing facilities. We don't know if for the moment the North Koreans believe that their nuclear program is sufficiently mature that they don't need to carry out any further tests in the immediate future. But it is a very curious dance that we've been seeing over the last few weeks. A whole debate about the timing of the summit, its potential location, what would be talked about. And I think, there will be many sort of seasoned diplomatic observers who say that this was kind of inevitable, in part because it seemed so fantastic that North Korea would be willing to give up its nuclear weapons any time soon, but also because this was simply approached in completely the wrong way. The traditional approach in diplomacy is to sound out if there's an opportunity, then to do patient legwork, perhaps for months, perhaps even years, working out the deliverables, what can be agreed, what comes next, what process can be set in train, and then finally to announce, yes, you're going to have the summit, at which point the leaders go along and sign on the dotted lines. You have the photo opportunities for people like us and so on. This summit was approached in entirely the opposite way. They decided they were going to have it. It was all very bizarre. From the American side, they don't seem to have really considered what precisely they were going to expect or demand from the North Koreans beyond the vaguest terms. And of course, the key question now is what happens next. If you think back to before the Winter Olympics, when the rhetoric between Pyongyang and Washington was at its highest, there were serious experts who were talking about a 50-50 chance of a war between the US and North Korea in the not too distant future. Now, that was mitigated by the goodwill surrounding the Winter Olympics. You've had this period where the North Koreans have not done nuclear tests. One assumes they can't do any more now if they really have destroyed this testing site, but they've also seemingly suspended ballistic missile tests for a period. Are they going to review that suspension? Are they going to go back to launching ballistic missile tests? And if they do, what is the American response going to be then?
Jonathan, for the moment, thank you very much, Jonathan Marcus, our World Affairs correspondent. Let's speak to our Washington correspondent now, Gary O'Donoghue. Gary, they weren't taken in then by this gesture to blow up the tunnels. The meeting's off at the moment.
Yeah, and it's an extraordinary development, this really, because just a few hours ago the president was sounding a bit more positive, certainly a lot more positive than this letter, this personal letter represents, talking here about anger and open hostility. I mean, there is a caveat in here which says that the meeting is off for the time being, effectively, but there's also a threat, an extraordinary threat. If I may just read you this paragraph. He says, this is Donald Trump to Kim Jong-un. He says, "You talk about your nuclear capabilities, but ours are so much more massive and powerful that I pray God they will never have to be used," which is a straightforward military threat, if you like, a warning to the North Koreans not to restart that program in the way Jonathan was just mentioning, not to start developing again that intercontinental ballistic missile capability, and perhaps to try and bring them back to the table that way. But it won't go down well. We know that those sort of threats don't work well in Pyongyang, and we'll have to wait and see what their reaction is. But this is a huge, in a sense, this could have been a big foreign policy win for the Trump administration to get to some sort of meeting like that, to get some sort of dialogue and process underway. Yes, there was a lot of scepticism around about its efficacy and its potential to actually go anywhere in the future, but just to get to that point in time would have been something of an achievement when, as Jonathan was saying, war was being talked about in very clear terms previously. This is a big setback.
And insults don't go down particularly well against your vice president, supposedly, in Washington, D.C.
No, they don't. I mean, in a sense, both sides in this have done their fair share of that, haven't they? We've had Rocket Man from this side of the Pacific, and we've had all sorts of other insults coming from the north as well. So I think, in a sense, that they kind of cancel themselves out a little bit. But yeah, it's become personalised in a way that isn't necessarily best for those who would push the diplomatic process forward. And I think there's a big question now for Mike Pompeo, the new Secretary of State, the effort he's been in. He's been there twice, don't forget, already in preparation for this summit, secretly on the first occasion, not secretly on the second occasion, but he's been there twice. And as things stand, it looks like this is off for the foreseeable, but we will see exactly who moves first next to put something else on the table, if they do at all.
How much of this is about each side trying to wrong foot the other?
Well, there's a lot of guessing work goes on. Don't forget, it's quite hard, I think, for the US and indeed its allies to read North Korea at times. It's a very closed society. The US openly admits that it doesn't really have the kinds of level of intelligence and information that you would typically be able to get in order to judge another side very, very carefully and very closely and very accurately. So that's been a very difficult thing. But I think the sort of perhaps the speed of the desire for denuclearization has crept up on the North Koreans a little bit. The expectation of how quickly things would happen, what they would get in return. We don't know what's been said, obviously, in private sessions. They may have been looking for a lot more than the US were prepared to give. We don't know what leverage China has played here, whether they have, some concerns have been raised in Beijing, perhaps about the speed at which this was happening, because they have a security concern, if you like. This is a buffer. North Korea is a buffer zone, in effect, between China and a substantial American ally in Asia. So there are lots and lots of factors that could have gone into this. But I think there will be some pressure to try and salvage something from this, because before we got to this point of the discussion of the summit and the discussion of negotiations like that, before that point in time, we were at a point in time where there was a serious risk of military conflict, where the North Koreans seemed to be getting to a point where they had the the ballistic missile capability and the ability to stick a nuclear weapon on that missile and get somewhere near the west coast of America. And that was not just for this administration, but the one previously. It was right up there in terms of foreign policy priorities.
So the summit's supposed to have been taking place on June the 12th in Singapore. What would need to happen, certainly from the United States perspective, for it to be back on again?
Well, I think for the time being, this one is off. I mean, as I say, there is a small caveat in this letter that allows for a future summit or for something to change. There are no demands particularly in this letter, so there's no clear indication from the President as to what would change his mind. It would, I think, have to be a pretty substantial step, but we will see. I think Mike Pompeo, now the Secretary of State, will have a big job on his hands to try and reconstruct some kind of lines of communication to see whether there's any room for manoeuvre, and perhaps to schedule it for later on. But at the moment, I think you'd be wasting your money if you betted on this actually transpiring on the June the 12th.
Gary, thank you very much. Gary O'Donoghue,